The paint can was perched on the edge of the curb, a 5-gallon bucket of what the Homeowners Association Architectural Review Committee had unilaterally decreed as heritage beige. It was a color with all the personality of a damp saltine cracker. The woman wielding the roller, Carol, our esteemed HOA president, was applying this beige mediocrity to my mailbox. It was 6:42 in the morning. I was on my second cup of coffee standing just inside my front door, watching her through the storm glass. She had no idea I was awake. She had no idea I had been awake for hours. She had no idea that the motion-activated, high-definition camera, disguised as a decorative birdhouse on the oak tree by the street, had been recording for the last 10 minutes. She had no idea about the file. The file was the most important thing. It was a 3-inch thick 3-ring binder, meticulously organized, tabbed, and cross-referenced. It had its own digital counterpart on an encrypted solid-state drive, of course. But I am a man who believes in the tangible permanence of paper. The file was my life's work, in miniature. My actual life's work had been for the National Archives, specializing in the verification and preservation of federal land patents and historical cartography. I spent 40 years ensuring that the paper trail of the United States was immaculate. Carol, with her cheap roller and her bucket of beige, was about to learn a great deal about the sanctity of a paper trail. She worked with a grim determination, her face set in the self-righteous mask of someone convinced of their own unimpeachable authority. Each stroke of the roller was an act of conquest. This was not about aesthetics. This was about power. My mailbox, a standard, black, heavy-gauge, steel model, approved by the Postmaster General, was the last bastion of non-compliance on our street. It was sturdy, functional, and, in my opinion, perfectly respectable. To Carol, it was a symbol of dissent. A black mark on her otherwise beige-washed canvas of suburban order. She finished the front, then moved to the side, humming a tuneless, vaguely triumphant little melody. I took another sip of my coffee. The steam warmed my face. Outside, the early morning air was cool, carrying the scent of cut grass and Carol's misplaced confidence. I watched her for another full minute. I considered the options. I could open the door and shout. I could turn on the sprinklers. I could call the sheriff. All of these were reactive, emotional, and ultimately unproductive. They were her methods, not mine. My methods were slower, quieter, and far more devastating. My late wife Eleanor used to say I had the patience of a glacier. "You don't rush," she'd told me once. "You just grind everything down to dust eventually." She had meant it as a compliment. I chose to take it as one. Carol finished her work, placing the roller carefully on a plastic sheet she had laid out. She stood back, hands on her hips, admiring her handiwork. The mailbox was now a lumpy, unevenly coated monument to beige. The little red flag was stuck down with wet paint. The black numbers of my address were completely obscured. It was, in the precise language of the United States Postal Service, now a non-compliant mail receptacle. It was also, and this was the critical part she could never have understood, federal property. You can't just paint someone's mailbox. Or rather you can, but in doing so you are not committing an act of vandalism against a homeowner. You are committing a federal crime. I set my coffee cup down on the hall table. I walked to my study, the room where I had spent most of my time since Eleanor passed. I sat down at my large oak desk, the surface clear except for a blotter, a pen set, and a single telephone. I picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory, a very specific number. Not the sheriff, not my lawyer, not yet. I dialed the 24-hour command center for the United States Postal Inspection Service. A calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Postal Inspection Service, how may I direct your call?" I took a deep breath. "Yes," I said, my voice even. "I'd like to report the willful destruction and obstruction of a United States Post Office-approved Mail receptacle, currently in progress. I gave the dispatcher my address. I gave her Carol's name, which I knew because she had introduced herself while committing the act. The camera had recorded it all. "Ma'am," she had declared to my empty front door just minutes before, "I am Carol Jensen, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and this mailbox is in violation of Covenant 7.3b. This is your final, official notice." She had no idea she had just identified herself, on camera, while committing a felony. She had no idea that her final, official notice was the capstone on a mountain of evidence I had been building for 3 years. She had no idea. But before I tell you what happened next, I should probably explain. This wasn't just about a mailbox. It was never just about a mailbox. It was about the slow, creeping rot of petty tyranny and the quiet, methodical work required to excise it. It started, as these things so often do, with good intentions and a power vacuum. Our HOA had been a benign, sleepy entity for years, run by a rotating cast of retirees who were more interested in the annual potluck than in enforcing the finer points of the covenant. They collected the dues, they paid the landscaper for the common areas, and they left everyone alone. It was a system that worked. Then, 5 years ago, Harold Fleming, the president for as long as anyone could remember, passed away. The vacuum he left was filled, almost immediately, by Carol Jensen. Carol and her husband had moved in about a year before that. They were younger than most of the residents, in their late 40s, with a restless energy that stood out in our quiet community. Carol was a former regional manager for a chain of home goods stores, a job title she mentioned with casual frequency. She had, as she put it, a background in operational excellence and brand compliance. She saw our neighborhood not as a collection of homes, but as an underperforming asset with inconsistent brand messaging. She ran for the board on a platform of protecting our property values. It sounded harmless enough. No one else wanted the job. She won by acclamation at a poorly attended meeting in the community clubhouse. Her first year was a flurry of activity. She redesigned the newsletter, organized a Community Pride Day, and had new, professionally printed signs installed at the entrance. There were murmurs of approval. She seemed effective. Then came the notices. It started small. Mr. Henderson at number 42 received a violation letter because his garden hose was not coiled in a visually pleasing concentric pattern. Mrs. Gable at number 18 was cited for having a wind chime that was not on the pre-approved list of audible decorations. The list, of course, did not exist. The violations were trivial, but they carried the threat of a $25 fine, escalating to $50, then $100. Most people like Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Gable were retired and on fixed incomes. They were conflict-averse. They grumbled, but they paid. They coiled their hoses. They took down their chimes. Each small victory emboldened Carol. My first direct encounter with her was 2 years and 11 months before the Great Beige Mailbox incident. Eleanor had passed away a few months prior, and I was still navigating the vast, silent emptiness of the house. Eleanor had been the gardener. Her rose bushes were her pride and joy. I was doing my best to keep them alive, but my thumb was decidedly not green. A few of the bushes near the sidewalk had become a bit overgrown. One afternoon, I found a crisp, white envelope taped to my front door. It wasn't a friendly note. It was a formal notice of violation from the Whispering Pines, HOA. It cited Covenant 4.1a, maintenance of landscaping, and stated that my rose bushes were encroaching on the public walkway by approximately 4 inches. It included a photograph, a deadline for remediation, and the now familiar schedule of fines. I was more weary than angry. I trimmed the bushes that evening, well back from the sidewalk. I took a photograph of the remediated bushes, printed it, and mailed it with a polite note to the HOA's post office box. I thought that would be the end of it. A week later, I received a bill for a $25 fine. The reason stated, failure to remediate violation in a timely manner. I had remediated it the same day I received the notice. I had proof. But arguing seemed exhausting. It was only $25. Like most of my neighbors, I paid it. I wrote the check, and as I filled out the memo line, fine for 4.1A, paid under protest. A switch flipped in my mind. For 40 years, my entire professional existence had revolved around the principle that a clear, verifiable record was the ultimate arbiter of truth. A dispute without documentation was just noise. A dispute with documentation was a case. I had just created the first document in a new case. I went to my study. I took out a fresh manila folder. With a fine-tipped pen, I wrote Carol Jensen /HOA on the tab. Inside, I placed a copy of the violation notice, my photo of the trimmed bushes, my letter, and a photocopy of the canceled check. I then went to my computer and created a new directory on my encrypted drive. I scanned each document, creating a PDF. I named them with a clear, consistent convention. Full YYYY-MM-DD_document type_description.pdf. It was the start of the file. It was the start of the work. On paper, it was just a $25 fine. But on paper is where I lived. On paper is where I was strongest. Over the next 3 years, the file grew. I became a quiet observer, a chronicler of Carol's reign. I kept every newsletter, every email, blast, every notice. I paid my own minor, baseless fines without complaint. Always by check. Always noting the purpose on the memo line. Always keeping the receipts. I kept the receipts for everything. When Carol had the common area, trees pruned, and the board approved a special assessment to cover the exorbitant cost, billed by a company called Executive Landscape Solutions, which, a quick search of state business filings revealed, was registered to Carol's husband. I paid my assessment and added the invoice and the corporate filing to the file. When she unilaterally decided that all trash receptacles must be stored inside the garage, not on the side of the house, and fined half the neighborhood, I documented it. I spoke to my neighbors. Not to organize, not to incite, but simply to listen. Mr. Henderson told me in a hushed voice over the fence that Carol had threatened to put a lane on his house over the placement of his bird bath. He was terrified, and he was an 80-year-old man who had lived in that house for 50 years. Mrs. Gable showed me a notice she'd received, fining her for unapproved holiday decorations, because the wreath on her door had pine cones, and apparently pine cones were not part of the approved festive palette. Their stories all had a common thread: fear, frustration, and a sense of powerlessness. They were good people who just wanted to be left alone. Carol's power was derived from the fact that no single infraction was worth the cost and effort of a formal fight. The $25 for the hose, the $50 for the wind chime, the $100 for the trash can. It was always easier to just pay. She was bleeding the community dry with 1,000 tiny cuts, and each payment was a small concession of defeat, a reinforcement of her authority. I recorded their stories as anonymized, dated entries in a separate section of the file labeled Witness Accounts. I wasn't a vigilante. I was an archivist. I was simply collecting the record. The record, I knew, would eventually speak for itself. The mailbox issue had been simmering for about 6 months. Carol, in her quest for aesthetic uniformity, had decreed at an HOA meeting, which I attended, sitting silently in the back, taking notes, that all mailboxes in Whispering Pines were to be replaced with a single approved model, a flimsy, plastic affair in, of course, heritage beige. The cost was $250, installed, payable to the HOA. Alternatively, homeowners could purchase the box themselves from a supplier she recommended and paint it the correct color. A few people grumbled about the cost, but the motion passed. Most of the board members were either her allies or too intimidated to vote against her. A woman named Brenda, who had been on the board for years, looked uncomfortable but raised her hand with the rest. I did nothing. I did not replace my mailbox. My mailbox was a fortress. It was a Gibraltar-class high-security model made of 10-gauge powder-coated steel. I had installed it after a small rash of mail theft in the area a decade ago. It could probably withstand a direct hit from a car. It was also, and this is what mattered, fully compliant with USPS regulations. The first notice arrived. Notice of non-conforming mailbox. I read it, scanned it, and filed it. The second notice arrived a month later, this time with a $100 fine. I scanned it, filed it, and then I began to compose a letter. This was not a task I undertook lightly. A letter, in my world, is a precision instrument. I spent an entire afternoon drafting it. It was 2 pages long, single-spaced. It cited the specific model of my mailbox and the USPS regulation it complied with. USPS-STD-7B. It referenced the original plat map for our subdivision, filed with the county in 1983, which designated the curbside areas as public utility easements. It respectfully pointed out that while the HOA had authority over the aesthetic appearance of homes, that authority did not extend to fixtures within a federal and county-mandated easement, especially when those fixtures were regulated by a superior authority, namely, the United States Postal Service. I included photocopies of the relevant pages from the USPS Domestic Mail Manual, the county plat map, and the product specification sheet for my mailbox. I sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested. This was a critical step. Certified mail creates an undeniable, legally binding record of delivery. An email can be deleted. A conversation can be denied. A signed green card from the Postal Service is irrefutable proof. A week later, the little green card came back to me in the mail, bearing the scrawled signature of Carol Jensen. She had received my letter. She had the facts. She had the documentation. I had given her a clear, honorable, and inexpensive off-ramp. I had laid out the truth for her on paper. I fully expected the matter to be dropped. At the very least, I expected a rebuttal, a counter-argument, perhaps a letter from the HOA's lawyer. What I got instead was silence. And then, a month later, another notice. This one was for a $250 fine for the mailbox, plus a $50 late fee for the previous unpaid fine. The letter I had so carefully crafted had been utterly and completely ignored. This was the moment the conflict shifted. It was no longer about a misunderstanding or a difference of interpretation. Her ignoring my certified letter was a conscious choice. It was a declaration that the facts did not matter, that the law, as written, did not matter, that the only thing that mattered was her will. She was not just mistaken, she was contemptuous of the very idea of a rule-based system that did not bend to her. She had no idea how gravely she had miscalculated. My 40 years at the archives had taught me that the system of laws and regulations that holds a society together is a fragile thing, built of paper and ink and mutual consent. People like Carol were termites, chewing away at the foundations. I went back to my desk and got to work. My professional work had not been just about storing paper. It was about research. Deep, esoteric, painstaking research. I still had my high-level access to several federal and academic databases. I started with the Whispering Pines subdivision itself. I pulled the original developers' filings from the 1980s. I read through the geological surveys, the environmental impact statements, the traffic flow analyses. Buried deep in an appendix to the utility plan, I found it. It was a single paragraph, easily missed. It was a mail delivery service agreement between the developer, Centurion Homes, and the regional office of the United States Postal Service. Back in the 80s, the USPS was pushing developers of new, large subdivisions to install neighborhood delivery and collection box units, those big, cluster mailboxes, to save on delivery costs. Centurion Homes, however, had successfully argued for traditional curbside delivery, but there was a condition. The USPS had agreed, provided that the developer ensure that all mail receptacles met specific durability and security standards, and that the easements they sat on would be perpetually maintained for postal access, free from obstruction. The agreement specifically stated that these conditions shall run with the land and be binding upon any subsequent homeowners association. It was a bombshell. The HOA did not have the authority to mandate a weaker, non-compliant mailbox. It was, in fact, contractually obligated by a federal agreement to ensure our mailboxes were of a high standard. Carol's beige plastic box was not just a violation of postal regulations. It was a violation of the foundational agreement that allowed our neighborhood to have curbside delivery in the first place. I printed out the agreement. I contacted a former colleague of mine, David, who had retired from the USPS office of the Inspector General. I explained the situation to him in dry, precise terms. "Arthur," he said, his voice crackling over the phone, "you've got her. This isn't just an HOA spat. If she's forcing residents to remove compliant boxes and install non-compliant ones, and if she's doing it for financial gain through the HOA, that's conspiracy to defraud the United States. And tampering with an existing, compliant box, that's a felony. You have the original agreement?" I told him I did. "Send it to me," he said. "I'll make sure it gets to the right desk, but you need to let her complete the act. Let her create the undeniable evidence." Which brought me back to this morning. Carol, her face flush with victory, was packing up her paint supplies. She had just completed the act. She had provided the undeniable evidence, and the inspectors David had alerted were likely already on their way. She took one last, long look at my lumpy beige mailbox, a smug little smile playing on her lips. Then she turned and marched back toward her own house, the very picture of a job well done. I waited until she was out of sight. I stepped out my front door into the cool morning air. The paint was still wet, tacky to the touch. The smell was cloying, a cheap chemical odor that clung to the air. My house numbers were gone, swallowed by the beige tide. The little red flag, the signal for outgoing mail, was glued fast. She hadn't just painted it, she had rendered it useless. I took out my phone and took several high-resolution photographs from multiple angles, ensuring the timestamps were embedded in the metadata. I added them to the digital file, another brick in the wall of evidence. I was about to go back inside when I saw a car I didn't recognize pull up and park across the street. It was a plain, white Ford sedan, the kind that is designed to be invisible. Two men in nondescript polo shirts and slacks got out. They didn't look like cops, they didn't look like salesmen. They looked like what they were: federal agents. They had the quiet, observant posture of men who miss nothing. One of them held a file. They stood for a moment, looking at my mailbox, then at my house, then down the street in the direction Carol had gone. I gave a slight nod. The taller of the two men met my gaze and gave a barely perceptible nod back. They were not here for me. They were here for her. The process was in motion. My phone rang about 2 hours later. It was the county sheriff's dispatch. "Sir, we have a deputy en route to your location regarding a complaint about property damage." I thanked them and hung up. Of course, the second act of her performance. After committing a crime, she was now calling the police on me, presumably to file a complaint that I had somehow provoked her into it, or to create a record of my non-compliance. It was a classic bully tactic: strike first, then play the victim. I walked to the hall closet and took out the file. The big, 3-inch binder. I placed it on the dining room table, the one Eleanor and I had bought for our 25th anniversary. It felt heavy, solid, a ballast of pure fact in a sea of nonsense. When the deputy's cruiser pulled into my driveway, Carol was already on her lawn, waiting. She had changed into a crisp linen pantsuit, her official business attire. She strode toward the deputy, a hand outstretched, her face a mask of concerned authority. I watched through the window as she began her performance. Her hands flew, punctuating her points. She pointed at my house. She pointed at her own pristine, HOA-approved mailbox. She gestured up and down the street, indicating the beautiful, beige uniformity she had achieved. The deputy, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, listened patiently, nodding. He had his notebook out, but he wasn't writing much. After several long minutes of this one-sided conversation, the deputy finally detached himself from Carol and walked up my driveway. Carol followed a few paces behind, arms crossed, a stern look on her face, as if she were a prosecutor observing a perp walk. I opened the door before he had a chance to knock. "Good morning, deputy," I said calmly. "Arthur Pinter," he said, glancing at his notes. "That's right. Sir, I'm Deputy Evans. I've received a complaint from Miss Jensen regarding an unapproved alteration to your property that is in violation of your HOA covenants." He said the words with a practiced neutrality, but I could see the weariness in his eyes. He'd dealt with people like Carol before. "She's referring to the mailbox," I said, gesturing toward the beige monstrosity at the curb. "Yes, sir. She states that you have refused to comply with community standards, and that she, as the HOA president, was forced to take action to remedy the situation." "Did she tell you she painted it herself this morning?" I asked. Deputy Evans's pen paused. "She characterized it as arranging for the remediation of a covenant violation, sir." "I see," I said. "And did she also tell you that in doing so, she was destroying what is legally considered United States Postal Service property?" Carol, who had been hovering at the edge of my lawn, shouted. "That is ridiculous. It's his mailbox on his property." Deputy Evans turned. "Ma'am, please allow me to speak with Mr. Pinter. You've given your statement." She huffed but fell silent, though she did not retreat. "Deputy," I said, lowering my voice slightly, "I understand this is a civil matter between myself and the HOA, and I don't want to waste your time. However, Ms. Jensen has made a number of false claims, and I would like to make a statement for the record, for your report. May I do that?" "Of course, sir. That's why I'm here." "First," I began, "this is my property. I am Arthur Pinter." I handed him my driver's license. He examined it and handed it back. "Second, this is my home." I handed him a copy of my property deed, which I had placed at the front of the file. He looked at it, then at me. A flicker of surprise in his eyes. Most people don't have their deed handy. "Third, the mailbox in question is a federally approved high-security receptacle, and its placement is within a designated public utility easement as defined by the county." I handed him the plat map and the USPS regulation page. He took the papers, his expression shifting from weary duty to genuine interest. He read them carefully. "And fourth," I said, "this morning, at approximately 6:30 a.m., Ms. Jensen trespassed onto my property and willfully damaged that receptacle. I have the entire incident on video." Carol gasped from the lawn. He's been spying on me." Deputy Evans looked at her, then back at me. "Sir, do you wish to press charges for trespassing and vandalism?" This was the moment. The pivot. Pressing charges would turn this into a local squabble. It would be my word against hers in a county court, bogged down for months. It would be a distraction from the main event. My goal was not to punish Carol for painting a mailbox. My goal was to dismantle the entire illegal framework of her power. "No, Deputy," I said. "I do not wish to press charges at this time. The relevant federal authorities have already been notified and are handling the matter of the destruction of federal property. I simply want it noted in your official report that Ms. Jensen admitted to you that she was responsible for the paint, that I have provided you with documents establishing my ownership and the legal status of the mailbox, and that I have video evidence of the event. I would also like a copy of the final police report, please. And I would appreciate it if you would note in the report that your body camera was active during this entire conversation." Deputy Evans's eyebrows shot up. I had just laid out a perfect, self-contained package of evidence for him. I wasn't asking him to solve my problem. I was asking him to be a witness, to create another official document for my file. He looked from the papers in his hand to me, then over my shoulder to the massive binder on my dining room table. He looked at Carol, who was now sputtering with indignation. And then he looked back at me, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. He understood. "Yes, sir," he said, his tone now crisp and professional. "I can certainly do that. Everything you've said will be in the report. You'll be able to pick up a copy in 3 to 5 business days." He handed the papers back to me. "You have a good day, Mr. Pinter." He turned, gave Carol a curt nod without breaking his stride, and got back in his cruiser. As he backed out of the driveway, I saw him speak into his radio. He was probably advising dispatch that the situation was civil in nature, but that one party was significantly more credible than the other. Carol stood on the sidewalk, momentarily stunned into silence. She had called the law to be her sword, and it had refused to be drawn. Worse, I had turned her own weapon against her, using the officer's presence to forge another link in my chain of evidence. She stared at me, her face a mixture of confusion and rage. The script had been thrown out. This was not how it was supposed to go. The little old man was supposed to be flustered, intimidated. He was supposed to argue and yell, allowing her to play the part of the calm, rational authority figure. I had done none of those things. I had simply shown him the paper. I gave her a small, polite nod, and then I closed my front door, leaving her alone with the lumpy beige evidence of her spectacular miscalculation. The rest of the day passed in a strange calm. The storm had broken, but the thunder was still rolling in the distance. Around noon, I saw Mr. Henderson from 2 doors down, shuffling up my walkway. He was a frail man, bent by age and worry, and he clutched a small, padded envelope in his hands, as if it were a holy relic. He looked nervously over his shoulder as he approached my door. I opened it before he knocked. "Mr. Henderson," I said, with a warmth I hadn't realized I was capable of. "Come in, please." He scurried inside, and I closed the door behind him. He stood in my entryway, turning his worn tweed cap in his hands. "Arthur," he began, his voice raspy, "I saw the police. I saw her face after. I think you're doing it. I think you're actually fighting back." "I'm just a stickler for the rules, George," I said, guiding him toward the living room. "Would you like some iced tea?" No, he said, waving it off. "I can't stay. I wanted to give you this." He pushed the padded envelope into my hands. It was surprisingly heavy. "What is it?" I asked. "It's from the meetings," he whispered. "The HOA meetings. Carol never let us see the real minutes, just her sanitized version in the newsletter. But my grandson, he gave me this little digital recorder. I'm hard of hearing, you see. I told her it was to help me follow along. She just laughed, called me an old coot." He looked down at his shoes. "I recorded everything. For the last 2 years. Every meeting. Every time she shouted someone down. Every time she made up a rule on the spot. Every time she threatened someone with a lien. It's all in there." I looked down at the envelope. Inside was a small, high-capacity USB drive. It was a treasure trove. It was the one thing my paper file lacked. Her voice. Her own words. Unmediated. Unfiltered. Documentation is about corroboration. I had the paper, the photos, the official reports. George Henderson had just handed me the soul of the machine. "George," I said, my voice thick with emotion. This is an act of incredible courage." He finally looked up, and his eyes were watery. "For 20 years this was a good place to live. A quiet place. She took that away. You get it back for us, Arthur. You use that, and you get it back." He squeezed my arm, then turned and shuffled out the door before I could say another word. I was no longer just an archivist. I had become an archive. Later that afternoon, an email landed in my inbox. The sender was anonymous, a temporary address from a secure service, but I knew who it had to be. Brenda, the uncomfortable-looking board member. The email was brief. "The emergency board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow night, 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. She's going to try to issue a summary judgment and place a lien on your property for extreme non-compliance and hostile behavior. She's telling everyone you threatened the police officer. I'm attaching the unredacted minutes from the last 6 board meetings. She's been using the HOA's lawyer for her personal vendettas. We've paid him over $10,000 this year to send threatening letters to residents. I'm sorry, I should have spoken up sooner. Attached was a password-protected PDF. The password was enough. I spent the rest of the day and most of the night in my study. The quiet, methodical work. I listened to George's audio files, cross-referencing them with Brenda's minutes. The synergy was devastating. In the minutes, a motion would be recorded as discussed landscaping violations and approved fines. On the audio, you could hear Carol shouting down Mrs. Gable for her unauthorized petunias, saying, "I don't care what the nursery told you, Martha. I am the final authority on what constitutes a pleasing floral arrangement in this community, and if you don't rip them out, I will have them ripped out and bill you for the privilege." I transcribed the most damning quotes, noting the date, time, and file number of the corresponding audio track. I added Brenda's minutes and my transcriptions to the master file. The final piece of Carol's desperate escalation arrived the next morning, delivered by a courier. It was a thick packet from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice of a liane intent. It was a breathtakingly audacious document, filled with legal-sounding but ultimately meaningless phrases. It accused me of being a persistent and vexatious litigant. I had never sued anyone in my life, of creating a public nuisance, my quiet, orderly home, and of engaging in a campaign of harassment against the association's president by sending one certified letter. It stated that if I did not immediately pay a cumulative fine of $2,500 and replace my mailbox within 24 hours, the HOA would place a lien on my house. It was her last, desperate, over-the-top move. It was also deeply, profoundly stupid. Filing a fraudulent lien is a serious offense. She was now creating a paper trail that led directly to civil and potentially criminal liability for herself and her lawyer. I scanned the entire packet and emailed a copy to the one lawyer I kept on a modest retainer, a specialist in property law. His reply was succinct. "This is malpractice. They've hung themselves. Let them have the meeting. I'll be there. Just bring your folder." The clubhouse was packed. Carol had clearly rallied her supporters. The first 2 rows were filled with the handful of residents who benefited from her rule. The sycophants, the fellow power trippers on the Architectural Review Committee. They greeted her with hugs and murmurs of support as she entered, beaming, holding a clipboard. In the back, scattered and looking nervous, were the others. Mr. Henderson was there, sitting by the wall, looking smaller than ever. Mrs. Gable was there, clutching her purse. I saw a few other faces I recognized from my quiet canvassing, people who had been fined for the color of their door or the height of their grass. And in the very back, near the exit, was Brenda, her face pale, avoiding eye contact with anyone. I took a seat in the middle, my lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Mr. Davies, beside me. Between us on the floor was the binder. It seemed to hum with a low-level energy. Carol called the meeting to order. "As you all know," she began, her voice dripping with practiced solemnity, "we are here tonight to address a serious issue of non-compliance that threatens the harmony and property values of our entire community." She went on for 10 minutes, a masterclass in performative victimhood. She spoke of her tireless, unpaid efforts to maintain standards. She talked about verbal abuse and threats she had endured, a complete fabrication. She painted me as a rogue element, a troublemaker who refused to play by the same rules as everyone else. Her voice trembled at the end as she said, "It is with a heavy heart that I must ask the board to approve the motion to place a lien on the property at 214 Elm Street, owned by Mr. Arthur Pinter, for his continued and hostile refusal to comply with our community's covenants." Her supporters burst into applause. The other board members, seated at the table with her, looked down at their papers, avoiding my gaze. "Is there any discussion?" Carol asked, a rhetorical question. She was about to call the vote. "I believe I have the floor." Mr. Davies's voice cut through the room like a shard of glass. He was standing now, Carol looked momentarily thrown. "This is a homeowners meeting for homeowners," she snapped. "I am here as counsel for Mr. Pinter," Davies said smoothly. "And since you are proposing a legal action against him, he is entitled to representation. It's in your own bylaws, Article 12, Section 4. Or, we can call the court clerk in the morning and have them explain it to you." Carol's face went white. She knew he was right. She had overreached, assuming I would come alone. "Fine," she spat, "be brief." "I will be," Davies said. "My client, Mr. Pinter, has no desire to be difficult. He is a man who values peace, quiet, and order. He also values rules. Real rules, not the ones you invent to bully your neighbors." He turned to me. "Mr. Pinter, if you would." I stood up. I didn't have a projector, as I had fantasized. This was better. This was more intimate. I walked to the front of the room and placed the binder on the table in front of the board members. I opened it to the first tab. "Exhibit A," I said, my voice calm and clear. "This is a copy of my property deed, establishing my ownership. Exhibit B is the county plat map, establishing the public utility easement on which my mailbox rests." I turned the page. "Exhibit C is a copy of the United States Postal Service Domestic Mail Manual, Section D, 041, which outlines the regulations for curbside mailboxes. My mailbox is compliant. The one you wish me to install is not." I turned the page again. "Exhibit D is the certified letter I sent you 3 months ago, explaining all of this. This is the return receipt, bearing your signature, proving you received and ignored it." A murmur went through the room. Carol's supporters were starting to look confused. My neighbors in the back were sitting up a little straighter. "Exhibit E," I continued, my rhythm steady, "is a copy of the police report from yesterday, in which Deputy Evans of the County Sheriff's Office notes that you admitted to vandalizing my property. It also notes that my body camera was recording your admission." The murmur grew louder. Carol's face had gone from white to a blotchy red. "This is ridiculous, he's twisting things." I ignored her and turned the page. Exhibit F is a thumb drive. It contains 2 years' worth of audio recordings of these very meetings, provided by a concerned resident. On it, one can clearly hear the president of this association threatening residents, inventing rules, and explicitly stating her disregard for established procedures. I looked directly at Mr. Henderson, who gave me a small, shaky thumbs up. "And Exhibit G," I said, my voice dropping slightly, "is perhaps the most interesting. It's a copy of the unredacted board minutes for the last 6 months, provided by another concerned party. They show that the HOA has paid over $10,000 to the law firm of Schmidt and Associates, the same firm that sent me this fraudulent lien notice, for services that appear to be less about the community's legal health and more about pursuing the president's personal vendettas." Brenda in the back took a deep, shuddering breath. She had broken ranks. The dam was breaking. Carol slammed her hand on the table. "This is an outrage. This meeting is over. The motion passes." But no one was listening to her. The other board members were staring, horrified, at the open binder. Her supporters were looking at each other, their confident smirks replaced with doubt. And then, the back doors of the clubhouse opened. 2 men and a woman walked in. They were dressed in dark blue windbreakers with USPS on the front and Inspector in bold yellow letters on the back. They were the men from the white Ford sedan, plus a supervisor. They moved with a quiet, implacable purpose. The room fell silent. The lead inspector, the woman, walked to the front. She didn't look at me. She looked only at Carol. "Carol Jensen?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Carol, her face a mask of utter disbelief, could only nod. "I am Postal Inspector Sarah Chen. This is Inspector Riley and Inspector Briggs. We have a federal warrant to search your home and to seize all records, digital and physical, pertaining to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." She held up the warrant. "We also have a warrant for your arrest." The collapse was instantaneous and total. The mask didn't just drop, it shattered. For a single long second, Carol's face was utterly blank. It was the face of a person whose entire reality, whose carefully constructed world of petty rules and absolute power, had just been vaporized. The smugness, The anger, the performative victimhood, all gone. In its place was a raw, naked panic. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted from the inspectors to me, to the binder, to the faces of her neighbors. In every eye she saw not the fear and deference she was used to, but a cold, clear judgment. She had no idea. She truly had no idea. Inspector Riley stepped forward, took her arm gently but firmly and said, "Ma'am, you need to come with us." And just like that, the reign of Carol Jensen was over. The aftermath was both as chaotic and as orderly as I had expected. Carol's arrest sent a shockwave through the community. It turned out that David, my friend at the OIG, had not been exaggerating. The charge wasn't just tampering with a mailbox. It was a raft of federal offenses. Conspiracy to defraud the United States government by systematically forcing the removal of compliant mail infrastructure, obstruction of mail by rendering my mailbox unusable, and wire fraud for using the HOA's email and payment systems to perpetrate the scheme. Her husband's landscaping company was also implicated, as it was being used to launder the profits from various fraudulent special assessments. The HOA's finances were frozen. The law firm that had filed the lien notice was investigated and later sanctioned by the state bar for filing a frivolous and malicious action. Mr. Davies, my lawyer, filed a motion on behalf of myself and a dozen other homeowners, and the court placed the HOA into a temporary receivership, appointing a neutral third party to manage its affairs until a new, legally elected board could be put in place. The first act of the receiver was to declare all of Carol's fines from the past 3 years null and void. The second was to send a check to every homeowner who had paid one, refunding their money with interest from the frozen accounts. My refund check for the original $25 Rosebush fine arrived about a month later. I photocopied it for the file, and then I framed it. It hangs in my study now, a small, quiet monument to the principle of the thing. The community began to heal. Brenda, with a newfound confidence, ran for president of the new board, and Mr. Henderson, his fear replaced by a sense of civic duty, agreed to serve as treasurer. Their first motion was to repeal every rule and amendment Carol had ever passed. The heritage beige mandate was abolished. The wind chimes returned. People put their trash cans on the side of their houses again. It was a small, quiet rebellion of normalcy. The neighborhood started to feel like a neighborhood again, not a compliance zone. People started talking to me. At first, it was just nods of respect. Then, people would stop me on my walks, wanting to shake my hand. Mrs. Gable brought me a plate of cookies. Mr. Henderson invited me over for a barbecue. I found myself, for the first time since Eleanor passed, having conversations that weren't about the weather. We talked about our kids, our gardens, the books we were reading. I learned that George Henderson was a retired history teacher who loved to talk about the Civil War. I learned that Brenda was a database administrator who appreciated the elegance of my filing system. We held a neighborhood potluck on the common green, the first in years. I brought Eleanor's famous potato salad. It felt right. A few weeks after the meeting, I received a package from the USPS. Inside was a brand new Gibraltar-class, high-security mailbox, identical to my old one, along with a polite letter thanking me for my civic-minded assistance in a federal investigation. A postal service truck arrived the next day, and 2 workers professionally removed the beige-smeared monstrosity and installed the new one, setting it in concrete. It was perfect, clean, black, functional, and utterly compliant. I live a quiet life. That hasn't changed. I still spend most of my days in my study, surrounded by my books and papers. But something is different. The silence of the house is no longer an emptiness. It's a peace I fought for, in my own quiet, methodical way. The file sits on my shelf, now labeled closed. Sometimes I take it down and look through it, not with anger or triumph, but with a kind of detached wonder. It's a testament to the idea that order is not a passive state. It must be maintained. It must be defended, not with shouting and threats, but with reason, with patience, and with an unwavering belief in the power of a well-documented fact. This morning, I sat on my porch with my coffee, just as I did on that day that seems so long ago. The sun was warm. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree. The mail truck pulled up, and the carrier placed a small stack of letters in my new mailbox, the little red flag clinking softly as she closed the door. It was a simple, ordinary event, a transaction of paper and trust, repeated millions of times a day. But it felt like a victory. A deep, long exhale, a sense of order finally and truly restored. I kept the receipts, and in the end, the receipts kept us.